Parsha is Bahar. Bahar means at the mountain. What it actually says is Bahar Sinai, right, at Mount Sinai. And the Parsha tells us that Hashem spoke to Moshe at Har Sinai and follows up immediately talking about the mitzvah of Shemitah. Mitzvah of Shemitah briefly is, Shemitah literally means like to leave, to rest. And what the mitzvah is that every 7th year, it's a mitzvah that's very niche these days because in terms of the percentage of the population that's involved in agriculture, it's now very small. But once upon a time, almost the whole world was involved in agriculture. And the mitzvah of Shemitah is that every 7th year, we have to stop working the land. And during that year, one is allowed to consume from their land, but only consume. Not allowed to store, not allowed to sell. And the land is available. You have to leave the land available. Anyone who wants can come and take. That doesn't mean that the owner is not allowed to eat. That whatever produce, whatever the field produces and whatever produce shows up during that 7th year is available to the public. Anyone can come and eat it. And the owner of the field can come and eat it too. They're allowed to eat it. But they're not allowed to store it. They're not allowed to sell it. So they can go to the field, harvest whatever they need to eat. And then when they're done eating it, they can go and get more. But they're not allowed to store it for after that year, and they're not allowed to sell it. Now, this mitzvah of Shemitah, it says that Hashem told Moshe at Har Sinai this mitzvah of Shemitah. And there is this idea that Chazal, that the sages take from this, that is that Shemitah here is, in a sense, sort of a placeholder on behalf of all the mitzvahs. And it teaches us something about the relationship between all mitzvahs and Har Sinai. So there is a relationship and a connection that all the mitzvahs, all 613 mitzvahs have to Har Sinai. Hashem gave us all the mitzvahs at Har Sinai, all the details of all the mitzvahs at Har Sinai. And Shemitah is sort of this token mitzvah that is, the Torah tells us explicitly about this connection and proximity between the mitzvah of Shemitah and Har Sinai on behalf of all the mitzvahs. If this is the case, if Hashem chooses to teach us this lesson about the connection and proximity and relationship between mitzvahs and Mount Sinai and Har Sinai, specifically through the mitzvah of Shemitah, Shemitah is sort of the representative of all the mitzvahs for this lesson. It seems like a bit of perhaps a strange choice of mitzvahs, because you would think it would make sense if there's this fundamental, and we'll talk about these lessons of Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, what is it that Har Sinai represents, that the Torah wants to emphasize that all the mitzvahs and all the details of all the mitzvahs relate back to and were given at Har Sinai. And we're going to express that explicitly in one representative mitzvah on behalf of all the others. You would think it would make sense to choose a mitzvah that is very clearly and obviously a general mitzvah that's representative of all mitzvahs. The mitzvah of believing in Hashem, the mitzvah of Avos Yisroel, something. I mean, this is like very specific. It's quite niche. The mitzvah of Shemitah only applies, first of all, in the land of Israel. So anyone that doesn't live in the land of Israel, this mitzvah doesn't apply to them practically at all. They're obligated to keep the mitzvah, but they don't live in circumstances in which it's applicable. It, according to most views and interpretations, it at minimum is only rabbinic when it's not the time of the Beis HaMikdash or when it's not the time of Yovel. Now, the mitzvah, the Shemitah, according to most opinions, is only rabbinic. There are opinions that actually say the mitzvah doesn't even apply at all now. So if there's this lesson that we need to learn about the meaning of Mount Sinai, what it represents, and the relationship and connection between that and all the mitzvahs, We have mitzvahs that apply 24/7 to every single Jew, regardless of where we live, when. There are a handful of those mitzvahs. They're called mitzvahs tmidios. They're 24/7 mitzvahs for everyone, period, like believing in Hashem. There are mitzvahs that are way more fundamental and broad and general. And this is very specific. It's only farmers, it's only agriculture, it's only in Israel at the time when there is the Yovel. It seems like a very, let's say, counterintuitive choice of representatives for all the mitzvahs. The truth is that what Shemitah is about is actually very representative of what is perhaps most fundamental about all of mitzvahs. And we're going to talk about this, discuss and clarify. So if you take a look, right, it says, and Hashem spoke to Moshe at Har Sinai, and he told him this mitzvah of Shemitah, that in the 7th year the land will rest. And then it says 6 years you may work the land, you shall work the land. Which again seems like there's no mitzvah to be a farmer. The Torah is not telling us we have to work the land for 6 years. You're allowed to have any other job if you want. Why is it telling us 6 years? And even someone who makes a living off a farm, technically, if they've figured out a way to farm the land every 4th year and it just produces enough, technically they could, can't they? Why is it saying 6 years you shall work the land? And regardless, that's not really the mitzvah. The mitzvah of Shemitah is not to work the land for 6 years. The mitzvah of Shemitah is to not work the land in the 7th year. So why does it say 6 years you shall work the land and in the 7th year you shall rest? And the answer lies in, ultimately, what all of everything is about. By all of everything, I mean all the Torah, all the mitzvahs, all the circumstances that we experience throughout the course of our life. It's the purpose of existence of time and space and matter and energy. It's the purpose of everything, the reason that anything other than just Hashem himself exists. Right? Because in the very beginning, there was just Hashem. Nothing else. And nothing else doesn't mean that there was nothing. There wasn't nothing, even. Right? And it's not an incorrect double negative. Nothing is a concept. In order to be able to say there is nothing, there has to be a concept of something and a concept of the absence of something which is nothing. But the concept of nothing didn't even exist. There wasn't anything. There was just Hashem. There was no concept. There was no logic. There was no reason. There was no anything. There was just Hashem. There was no time. There was no space. Nothing. And then, whatever then means, if there's not time, Hashem has this desire to have, as the Medrash says, the Medrash Tanchuma says, Hashem wants to have a dwelling place in Tachtonim being the lowest layer of reality, i.e., the circumstances in which it's the least natural for Hashem's presence to be integrated. The place where it's the least intuitive and natural that should be a dwelling place for Hashem. And so because Hashem wanted to have this unnatural, novel combination of opposites, where there is a circumstance or a layer of reality in which there is little, borderline, no awareness of Hashem's existence, and the nature of this reality is very mundane, very tangible, very material, and then Hashem should then be integrated into the fabric of this layer of reality. In order for that to happen, there need to be time and space in which the universe can be created. So Hashem brings time and space into being, brings mass and energy into being inside of time and space, perhaps. Perhaps on the inside. Perhaps on the description of mass and energy being inside time and space. And then creates this physical universe. And before the physical universe, there are other non-physical layers of reality on the way down here. And then Hashem creates this physical layer of reality and creates it intentionally in a way that is not in tune with spirituality, that's not in tune with divinity. And then Hashem gives us a manual, gives us guidelines, gives us instructions as to how to live in this world correctly so that its purpose is fulfilled, i.e. divinity, infinity, godliness, Hashem is integrated into the fabric of this reality. So the whole point of this is something that is a very complex melding of opposites in a way that doesn't actually make sense. And there is a lot of tension in that because it's a combining of opposites. And there are a lot of different things where we see, a lot of different themes and places where we see this sort of tension between opposites. Or things that seem opposites because they're pulling in opposite directions. They're not actually opposites at all. They all boil down to the same theme, to the same intention, to the same purpose, but the direction that they're pulling in is perhaps opposite, and we'll see what we mean. So, if our job, if what we're here to do, if the purpose of existence is to integrate the infinity of the Creator, to integrate divinity, to integrate Hashem, godliness, into the fabric of this physical world, into physical objects. Let's take a Chumash, right? This is a book. Ultimately, it's paper and ink and covers, right? But we don't treat this the same way that you would treat any mundane book. Why not? Because it's holy. It's sacred. What does that mean that it's holy and it's sacred? You don't put it on the floor, you don't put it in the garbage, you don't take it into a bathroom, we treat it with respect, we kiss it when we finish using it and put it back down. Why? What does it mean that it's holy? It says in the book somewhere, this is holy, therefore you shall treat it this way. No. It means that the infinity of the Creator is integrated into the paper and into the ink. And it has to therefore be treated with the respect that's appropriate for something that has the infinity of Hashem integrated into it. And our job, the purpose, the reason the universe exists and the reason that every one of us is here is to do that exact thing, the integration of the infinity of Hashem into the physical world, the fabric of the world, the processes of the world, the ways of this world, the way that it's supposed to be used and lived in. Through doing mitzvahs, etc., which means that we are in a very complex place. This is a very complex thing to pull off correctly. Because what we're doing on one hand, let's say for example, right, and I've used this metaphor before, I don't know if I've used it this year, but if you have, right, why is it that, it's a job that some people, will apply for or train for to be a court interpreter. Why do courts need interpreters? Because if you have someone that has a legal issue and they need to come to court and they don't speak the language of the country, if you have someone here who only speaks Mandarin, it's the only Cantonese, whatever, pick a language. It's the only language they speak and understand or speak a word of English, and they have to have an interaction, a conversation with someone who only speaks English and no Cantonese, there is no way for them to communicate. Until you get a third party who understands and speaks both languages and now can facilitate a conversation between the two because they can hear and understand both and speak to both. What we are here to do, because physical, I don't even love the word spiritual. It's the correct word if we define exactly what we mean by that. But let's say non-physical. The physical and the non-physical do not exist in realities. that which is not physical doesn't physically exist. Angels do not physically exist. They're not invisible. They're not physical. They don't physically exist. They exist. They're just as real as the physical, but it's a different kind of reality. The reality of the physical is defined by whatever the parameters are that define physical reality. And that which is not physical, its reality is defined by different parameters. They're not the same reality, and so they can't interact. And then Hashem takes us and gives us a body and a soul and mitzvahs, which puts us in a position to interact with physical objects, with other people, with the physical world, in physical time, in physical space. And in doing that with both our body and our soul, and doing mitzvahs the way that Hashem commanded us to and gave us these instructions, we now are the interpreters or the facilitators of the communication between the physical and the non-physical, and we can allow the non-physical to be integrated into the physical. The issue here is, the thing about this that's a lot more complex than just being an interpreter in a courtroom or any situation for language, is that the physical and the non-physical, the tangible and the abstract, the material and the spiritual, pull in very opposite directions. You know, I don't know whether this exists for any languages, but I'm just like imagining this. If, let's say that there was a language, let's take English for example, and let's say that there were a language in the world, and maybe there is, maybe not, I don't know, that it's not just a different language to English. Everything about the way the language works, the grammar, the vocabulary, the structure, the patterns, everything about this language was sort of opposite to English. And the way it worked was the opposite to the way it works in English at a very fundamental level. Now, I don't even know what that would mean necessarily, but let's say hypothetically. And so when someone who knows English wants to learn this language, the first thing that they are taught is, listen, you need to completely let go of English, because this language is like, all the mechanics of it are the complete opposite of English. And if you're thinking about English or in English, it's not going to work. You have to let go of English, embrace this language, and then you'll be able to get it. Now, if someone's having, let's say, interpreting a high level, they learn the language and now they've become very capable at both of these languages, and they, let's say, have to facilitate a conversation between, you know, some real ethereal scholars, one in each of these languages. So the things that they have to understand and interpret and translate are complex. It's going to be at a very high level of this language. It's very specific and delicate vocabulary. The structure of the sentences has to be very precise and perfect. And so when they're listening to what one of these scholars is saying, they have to really focus and become present in that conversation to really make sure they get it correctly. And then in order to translate it, they have to shift to a language where everything is completely opposite and figure out how to present it in a way that works and makes sense in that language. Then stay present there, hear that response at a very high level of complexity and precision and detail, and really be present in that language. And then figure out how to then let go back into the other language, right? And then present it all in a way that's going to be accurate and correct and precise and make sense in this language, even though it's presented in a completely different way to the way it was presented in the other language. Imagine going back and forth between, like, facilitating a conversation like that. It would be exhausting, first of all. It would be very challenging. It would be a difficult thing to do. And this is what all of us have to do. This is our job. If Hashem just wanted us to be spiritual, He would have just created the angels and stopped. He didn't need to continue and create us. The reason Hashem didn't stop after the angels and He continued to on this sort of process of creating layers of reality that was subsequently more and more tangible and less in touch with divinity, is because the point is Hashem wants to be integrated into the tangible, material, physical, mundane parts of this world. That's the whole point of the whole everything. Now, if we're going to do that, we are going to have to interact with the world. We have to touch physical objects, use them for mitzvahs. We have to be involved in the physical world, and it's not just about the physical objects, it's about the processes as well. And this is why we don't just get miracles to solve everything for us. Because when we do something, if there's, let's say, a mitzvah or an objective, something that we need to do, and there are some challenges involved and we need to figure out how to do it, so we use our creative abilities and our problem-solving abilities, and we come up with a solution, and then we go through that process to achieve this outcome, we have now integrated the infinity and divinity of Hashem into our creative, into the creative parts of our brain, into those neurons. We've integrated divinity and into the creative part of our soul, into the neurons that are involved in the problem-solving, and into those parts of our personality and our mind and our soul, and into every single physical thing, into the parts of our body that are involved in going through the process, into the parts of the world that are involved into the process, and into the process itself, into the concept of this process has also had the infinity of Hashem integrated into it. This is why things are not supposed to be done by miracles. They're supposed to be done by natural processes, because then the natural process itself becomes elevated. It has Hashem integrated into it. So on one hand, the more deeply we are involved in the mundane and physical parts of this world, the greater the extent to which we can fulfill the purpose for which we are here and the purpose of all of existence. So, on one hand, the more deeply we're involved in the mundane, tangible, physical parts of the world and processes of the world, the better. Conventionally, traditionally, most of what we would call, let's say, the, ultra-Orthodox Jews for hundreds, thousands of years, the very, very, let's say, Torah-observant Jews, have lived a life that doesn't look like that at all. It's isolated socially, isolated physically, isolated in terms of, what people did. There was a very strong tendency to try to minimize the degree of involvement out in the world, let's call it. And for very understandable and sound reason, which is, the world and all the things it has to offer is a very high-risk environment. If someone wants to live a life that's true to Torah, there are a lot of things that we get exposed to very quickly that add additional challenges that can be avoided if we're not involved. So that is not an unreasonable approach, and it's an approach that makes sense. But if we can manage to successfully pull off an approach that's radically different, which is get involved, but in a way where we stay on point and we do it safely and correctly, that's where the magic really happens. That's what, let's say, where the magic happens at the highest level. That's where that's where the magic really scales up, where it just starts to become part of the world at a whole different level of scale. The parts of the world that we involve and integrate, etc. The issue is that getting involved in the world, realistically, the nature of the human condition and the nature of the world and the nature of our interaction with it means that, in terms of our own personal spiritual integrity, that's a very high risk pursuit, getting involved in the world. And specifically in a way that is, the approach is, let's be involved in the world to the greatest degree possible. And this is why we have this cycle of 6 years working the land, 1 year time out. Right? For 6 years, we are there is probably nothing, or maybe certainly not much, that's more physical and tangible and material and worldly than getting out and plowing the field, digging up that dirt, whether you're doing it with a shovel or whether you're doing it with a plow that's tied to the back of an animal, getting out, sowing the field, harvesting. Farming is real, about as physical and worldly and earthly as it gets. you cannot be more involved with the mundane physicality of the world than being a farmer, basically. And that is primarily what we're here to do, is to do that work of being involved, getting our hands dirty out in the world. But if that's all we do, the likelihood of us veering off track, of getting lost, of paying that spiritual price is, I would say, almost inevitable. But I'm saying almost to be, conservative and generous. But ultimately, it's a matter of time. That's the question. Right? And so the Torah tells us, yes, it doesn't just say, if you would like, you can go out into the world for 6 years. It says 6 years, you may, but it's at minimum a recommendation. Get out there, be involved in the world. But in that 7th year, you need to step back. Right? What happens in Shemitah, if you think about it, imagine someone who makes their living and supports their family off their farm. And every 7th year, that's like 15% of the time, they can't be working the field. That could be a very scary thing, right? Accepting Shemitah for someone whose livelihood comes from the produce of their land, keeping Shemitah is a very, very big commitment. And this is a very big part of the idea. Shemitah is a timeout that it does two things that are kind of opposite at the same time, and they're kind of opposite, or they're at opposite ends of the spectrum, and they really complement each other and create a nice, almost like a sandwich, which is the time out from farming creates a space in time for really focusing on purpose, focusing on meaning. Why are we here? What is this all about? Why am I going out into the field every day? And a person who's, farming, let's say, especially before, we have all the technology, going back to farming not so long ago, it was long hours. It was just about full-time all day, every day for very big parts of the year. And, when's a person supposed to recalibrate? When's a person supposed to ground themselves and remember what this is all about and why they're here, etc. So first of all, we have Shabbos every week, which is a very similar idea. And then Shemitah is a whole year where you can really, really go deep. So on one hand, it creates a space in time where you're not working the land. You can really, really go deep and focus on these things. Ask these questions. And not ask them necessarily looking for the answer on paper, but ask the questions for ourselves in our soul and make sure that, and see whatever questions we have inside in terms of actually relating and connecting and accepting it, and work those things out, iron those things out. And number two is, Shemitah forces a person to have bitachon. There's no option but to rely on Hashem. So on one hand, it creates a pressure to really dig down deep into that faith. And at the same time, it also creates a space in time where we can work on building that up, on building a foundation, on constructing a building of solid faith, which means connecting to the ideas that are beneath the surface of bitachon. Bitachon is a sense of security, right? Bitachon doesn't mean... Bitachon, people will often use the words bitachon and emunah as though they're synonymous. They're not synonymous at all. They're in two completely different things. Now, completely different, I don't mean they're chalk and cheese. They are adjacent. They're next to each other, but they are distinctly different things. Emunah is belief in Hashem. It's the belief that Hashem exists and that Hashem is the creator of everything and nothing happens without Hashem making it happen, etc., etc., etc. Bitachon, what does bitachon mean now in Hebrew? Security, insurance. Bitachon means I feel secure in the fact that I will have what I need. Hashem's got me. A person can have 100% perfect emunah without having bitachon. A person can say, look, I'm terrified of what this afternoon or tomorrow or next year has in store. Like, this is really, really scary. Now, I know it all comes from Hashem, and I accept that 100%. I have no resentment. I accept it. I'm still scared. Right? So a person can have 100% emunah without bitachon at all. Bitachon means I have no fear. Hashem's got me. Hashem is going to give the outcome that I want/need. That's bitachon. Now, when a person feels afraid, I've said this story before. I said it recently in a different circumstance, and I didn't say the whole truth of it. I'm going to clap here in case I decide that I need to cut that out. Growing up, we had our next door neighbors. There was a lot of tension. There were like both families with lots of children, and both families with lots of children with very strong personalities and different personalities, and there was a lot of clash. Anyways, so, sorry? Yeah. Also Chabad. So, I can't say this is not my proudest moment. Honestly, I feel terrible, but I was a kid, and kids do things. So there was one time one of their kids from next door was outside, and it was night and it was dark. And for whatever reason, somehow they got locked outside. So I opened my window of my bedroom, and I was like going, woo, and making these scary noises. And this kid was saying, I'm not scared, 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 I'm not scared. What's the point I'm getting at here? Bitachon doesn't mean I'm not scared, I'm not scared, I'm not scared. If someone says, I'm not scared, I'm not scared, I'm not scared, the one thing you know for sure is that they're terrified. Nobody is like lying on the beach drinking a margarita saying, I'm not scared, I'm not scared, I'm not scared, I'm not scared. Right? We say that when we're scared. When a person feels afraid, bitachon does not mean, I'm not afraid, have bitachon, have bitachon, have bitachon. That is called suppressing or denying fear. And that is almost inevitably going to have serious consequences. There will be a price that will be paid for that. It's the way it works. It's the way Hashem created the world. What bitachon means is learning about, understanding, integrating, connecting to the ideas that make bitachon make sense and be reasonable. Right? Bitachon, if someone's afraid, the answer is not have bitachon. Because have bitachon is not a verb. You can't just have bitachon. It's not something you can do. What you can say to someone is, think about bitachon for a second. Like, do you understand bitachon? Does it make sense? Do you understand the basis for it? Yes. Oh, okay, now I'm remembering the ideas behind bitachon, the reason why bitachon makes sense and is a reasonable, thing, and it's something that I should do here. And as that clarity sets in, the fear will dissipate. Bitachon removes the basis of fear. Right? Bitachon doesn't mean deny fear. Don't be afraid, have bitachon. If someone has to say, I'm not going to be afraid, I'm going to have bitachon, that's not what bitachon means. That's called denying fear, suppressing fear. If a person says, hang on a second, I'm feeling really afraid. Should I feel afraid? Do I need to feel afraid? Are my circumstances, is my future determined by my circumstances, or is it determined only by Hashem? And is there such a concept as trach gut wird sein gut, which says that if you think good, that produces the positive outcome? Because Hashem, out of sort of reciprocal, this natural reciprocity, because it's natural to feel afraid, even though it's technically objectively incorrect, in terms of the full picture of reality where the future is determined by Hashem, not by the circumstances, it doesn't actually make sense to be afraid, but it makes sense that a person will feel fear nonetheless because that's the way we're created. And when we step outside of that and we say, you know what, no, I'm working on the clarity of my conscious awareness of the fact that my future is determined by Hashem and only Hashem and nothing else, my circumstances are irrelevant. And if I wouldn't wake up worried about how I'm going to pay my bills if there was $1 million of free cash sitting in my checking account, then I don't need to be afraid and worried about how I'm going to pay my bills if there's $0 sitting in my checking account. Because that's not what determines what's going to happen when I have to pay the bill. Hashem determines. Is it natural that a person will feel more concern if there's 0 in the bank than if there's $1 million in the bank? Of course it is. Doesn't mean it's correct, it means it's natural. So when we step outside of that and say, I'm not going to give in to this natural inclination to feel that fear, I'm going to focus on the truth, step away from that natural inclination, focus on the truth, and it takes work. It's a very challenging thing to do. It's a labor-intensive, demanding thing to do that. That creates a reciprocity where Hashem then steps away from the system and away from the nature. And even if Hashem had planned a negative outcome, the bitochen can actually influence the future and cause Hashem to give that positive outcome. That's trachgut ved zaingut. The bitochen creates the positive outcome.
Like if you feel anxiety or depression, this is a reflect from that you have a fear?
Okay, that's a big question. It really depends on what you mean by anxiety and depression, because there's a range of very different things that can all be referred to, with those terms. But ultimately, I mean, look, one of the most effective treatments for coping with anxiety and depression for both of them is CBT. Right, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. Just about. Right, and the premise of that is that the first step is cognitive. The cognitive part of CBT, of cognitive behavioral therapy, is when someone has depression or someone has anxiety that's like even debilitating, helping them understand what this is, what anxiety is versus what it's not, what depression is versus what it's not, where is it coming from, what are the processes that are causing it, help them understand what are the processes and the things they can do to mitigate it, and then help them construct then is the behavioral step, which is let's come up with a plan of action of things you can do built upon this foundation of cognitive of understanding that you have that are going to help move your body through the depression or the anxiety, right? The foundation of this, which is the most successful, I would say, treatment for coping with anxiety and depression, as far as I understand in the data at the moment, that's by far the most effective approach. And I say for coping with specifically, because then there's another whole can of worms aside from that. The basis is understanding. Now, in general, I would say if a person is feeling in a bad mood, a person is worried about something, then yes, a person straightening out their mind can literally be like magic. Because you're using the words depression and anxiety that can be used in a clinical sense and there can be a very strong biological, physiological component, it becomes a little bit more complex. But at the end of the day, even in a clinical setting, the most effective treatment for coping with clinical anxiety and depression is the cognitive behavioral approach, which starts with that cognitive step. So ultimately, yes. Right? So now let's say that we're not talking clinically. We're talking about a person's feeling down. A person's feeling worried or, let's say low-level anxious about something, concerned about something. The negative emotion, the down mood, the concern, the worry, all of it is built on top of some sort of perception that they have, right? The way that they perceive reality results in these negative emotions. And adjusting the perception changing the thought pattern or learning something that changes their perception can completely remove the foundation and the basis of those negative emotions. Right? So even when we talk about, the whole idea of Chabad is ultimately Chabad is not about our minds. Chabad is about our feelings and our behaviors. Right? The thing that primarily drives our behaviors is our feelings. But the key to enacting a real, actual, effective, sustainable, a truly transformative shift in our emotions is using our mind. It's changing our perception of things by becoming better informed. Right? So the Alter Rebbe's focus, this idea of Chabad that he started focus on learn and understand, it's not because he wanted us to be the best educated about mysticism. It's not because he wanted us to be academic. It's because he wanted us, his objective was, he wanted to empower every single one of us to be able to behave a certain way, to be able to have a certain experience of connection and realness with Hashem. And that experience, the emotions and the behaviors that result the primary key for a long-term real transformation is using our minds. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, Baruch Hashem. So, right, in a situation of Shemitah, a person, is very possibly going to have no choice but to put some work into their bitachon to be able to cope. They're also going to have the space to put in that work, right? Because bitachon, if bitachon is not, I'm not afraid, bitachon, that's not called bitachon, that's called denial or suppression. Bitachon is build your perspective from the foundation up so that you don't feel fear. That's a big project. Shemitah allows the space in time to be able to actually do that. And at the same time creates the pressure that sort of motivates and forces or makes that almost a necessity. So Shemitah pressures us to really dig deep in our relationship and connection with Hashem and our understanding of Hashem and the whole picture of reality and Hashem and all the context, etc. It also creates the space for us to actually be able to do that. Because to tell someone to do that and not create space in which for them to do that, it's like, thank you. Like, do you have any concept of like what it takes to do that? How much time it takes? To just, first of all, just to become present and then to be able to learn, think about, process all of these things. It's not a 10-second thing you can just like do by snapping your fingers. That being said, if a person has created that space in which they've done that work and built that foundation, it's very possible that a person can just have a reminder about bitachon. If a person's put in the work and they've learned and understand it and really gone through that process, and then they feel a bit worried, and then someone will say, well, remember your bitachon? And they're like, oh yeah, you know what? Yeah. And they're good. It's not because they said, oh, don't be scared, have bitachon. It's because the foundation for the bitachon is there. It was all there. They've brought themselves to that point and done that work of building that up. They got distracted. So they got reminded. They just readjust their mindset a little because it's already there. It's been built. And that can just, completely change everything very quickly. But that's only going to work if they've actually done the work of building bitachon. It's not because they were like, oh, bitachon, don't be scared. Because that's not a thing.
Or that
if you feel worried.
You feel worried? But you said it was natural to feel worried.
If you feel worried and you can't just tune into the bitachon and then the worry disappears. And remember, and I say that specifically, it's not about pushing away the bitachon or denying it. It's not saying the fear. It's not about saying no to the fear. It's about if you can tune into that bitachon and just feel calm, then you have sufficient bitachon at least for that challenge. If you try to do that and that concern, that fear, that nervousness, that anxiousness is still there, that means that we've still got some work to do on building that bitachon.
Thank you.
Good question, thank you. So now, bringing it back here, and this is sort of that complexity and tension that I was talking about. On one hand, and Chassidus especially always emphasizes the pursuit of spirituality, not being materialistic. Don't care about the material. Everything we eat, if you're going to eat, the reason you should eat is to get the nutrients you need to serve Hashem, and all the physical things and sleeping and whatever we're doing, we should be doing it in order to be able to do what we have to do in the most effective and healthy and proper, correct way possible and successful way possible. And focus on spirituality. On the other hand, we're saying, go get involved in the world, go get as deeply involved in the material and the tangible and the mundane as you possibly can manage. And not only is it not a contradiction, they go hand in hand. The more tuned in we are to our purpose, right? Because being involved in the mundane, the material, doesn't mean being materialistic or being personally attached to it. They're two very different things. Right, and I mean, taking the concept of if you want to help someone who's struggling with something inside, to be able to really help them requires, again, this very complex, to do it properly, a very important and big part of that is to be able to really be there for them and to hear them and to listen to them and to empathize and really feel what they're feeling, but not in a way that you get caught up and it brings you down and you get stuck in it and then you're stuck in the problem as they are. It's very easy when a person is really listening and trying to connect and be there and empathize to then get stuck in the problem, and then it's just like, oh my goodness, and you can have all the empathy and sympathy in the world, but you can't help them out because you get stuck in it together. Right? The ideal balance or complex sort of sweet spot there is being available to them, being present with them, and really empathizing, but without getting caught up in it, without getting attached to it, right? We can be involved in the material world. You know, if someone is, for whatever reason, if someone, let's say, and there are people who, you know, would come to the Rebbe and say, I want to, you know, become a teacher or go to Kollel, and the Rebbe will say, like, no, you have a very special talent and a gift for business. You should continue to be involved in business. And there are people who, you know, and if someone's, let's say, extremely successful in business, successful by, you know, the way that, you know, that people commonly think of success in business, and also very grounded and clear and focused and attached to their purpose and the meaning and what it's all about and why they're there, that person can then bring the message of Hashem, of Torah and mitzvahs, of purpose, of meaning, to people that are never going to talk to a rabbi, never going to talk to a shliach, never going to step within a country mile of a shul or a synagogue or anything, whatever, anything that they feel Jewish about, but they are in a meeting with this person about a business deal, and they just find themselves feeling naturally a sense of respect for this person because of the way they carry themselves and the integrity that you can't help but notice. And then this person's, and the fact that they appreciate how spiritually dialed in this person is and how strong their sense of purpose and meaning is, and also respects their business acumen and is in a room with this person because of where they're at in business, that person, because of how deeply involved they got in the world of business, and maybe they had to get very deeply involved to get there, but always saying strong and straight and true, they are able to bring the infinity of Hashem to places that other people are not. It's just one example. The more deeply we are involved in whatever part of the world is, and obviously it only means things that are kosher, right? It doesn't mean I'm going to eat pork, make a bracha, I'm going to eat a rack of baby back ribs, and they're going to be like super delicious, and I'm going to make a bracha, and I'm going to use all of those calories to learn Torah and do mitzvahs. It's like, no, that doesn't work. I'm going to go into a place that the Torah says I'm not allowed to go so that I can bring Torah and mitzvahs to people. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about in a way that Torah allows. The more deeply we get involved, the more effectively we can do it. But that's only sustainable and safe and going to be ultimately successful if it's balanced with this space in time where we make sure to go for a tune-up, to get focused, to dialed in. And we have the same thing in a micro version every week between the weekdays and Shabbos. The week is primarily for getting involved, doing the work, integrating Hashem into the world. And Shabbos is a time where we step back, okay, hang on a second. That was 6 days. It was heavy and full on, and I did everything I needed to do, but it's time to refocus because, it's starting to maybe get a bit risky or whatever it is, And within every day we have the cycle. We start the day with davening, with learning. And this is, if you look in Shulchan Aruch, the order of things in Shulchan Aruch, it starts out with washing hands, morning blessings, davening, learning Torah, the halachas of food, and then there's the halachas of business. Because that's the way it's supposed to be. We wake up, we daven, we learn, we eat, and then we go out and do what we have to do. And it's set up that way so that we're grounding and connecting ourselves so that when we do go out to do what we need to do, we'll actually be able to do what we need to do because it's not an unrealistic situation or, thing to envision that someone says, I want to go out and get involved in the world to bring all of this to people and share it with them. And I want to get deeply involved in the world. And by virtue of getting deeply involved in the world, they get caught up in that. They forget the reason they got there. They came in the first place, the whole motivation for doing it, and just get completely lost. Right? So being involved with material doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with being materialistic. If a person is told by their nutritionist or whatever it is that it would be really good for their health and well-being and focus and energy to eat a particular food and it happens to be their favorite food in the world, for them to say, oh, I enjoy it too much, I don't want to be materialistic, I'm not going to eat it. It's like, get over yourself. You have a job to do, you'll do the job better if you're well nourished, eat the food. Now you can eat the food and say, I'm eating this because I want to be able to serve Hashem, and my motivation for eating it is not materialistic, and I'm going to try to, have to start putting pegs on your nose, but I'm not here to get carried away in the sensory culinary experience. I'm going to eat the food, get the calories, do what I need to do. That's being involved in the material, but without being materialistic, and it's this balance of weekdays and Shabbos, of 6 years out in the field, and then that year off, that can allow us to be able to do this successfully. There has to be a cycle of back and forth, back and forth. Either way, if we just had Shabbos and Shemitah all the time, we'd be very spiritually in touch and we'd get nothing done in the world. If we're just doing 6 days and 6 years and not doing the Shabbos and the Shemitah, we're most likely going to get off track pretty quickly. So it has to go back and forth, this cycle of that allows us to really be able to get deeply involved but without getting lost. Be involved in the material without being materialistic. And that's why this is the mitzvah of Shemitah. This is ultimately the essence of everything. So it makes perfect sense that if Hashem is going to be telling us a lesson that is true to all of Torah and mitzvahs and something this fundamental, and you see it clearly in Shemitah, Shemitah is the actual mitzvah itself illustrates this. What better example could you have? Have a good week.